The final report from the Citizens' Assembly on drug use is going to be launched today. We'll hear from the Minister Hildegard Naughton in just a moment. But essentially, Paul Reid, the chairman of the Citizens' Assembly on drug use, has said that the report recommends a decriminalised model for anyone caught in possession of drugs for personal use, while keeping possession illegal under the law. By the way,
that's quite complex. But,
it is quite complex, but
that'll have to be worked out.
Yeah, but look, it's essentially saying if you get caught with a small amount of drugs for personal use, you're not going to be dragged through the criminal system.
And that's for all drugs. So they're talking about, it is like initially maybe I think there was talk that this might be around cannabis or solely and things like that, but that's for all drugs now. We think.
Narrowly voted against legalisation of cannabis. One vote.
Paul Reid will, of course, be on the hard shoulder tonight discussing all of this. But it got us thinking this morning, Shane, what do you make of it?
I am just a little concerned about where we're going with this. And there's loads of people who work in dealing with people with addiction. And I really respect them, and their views should be listened to. And I know they very much favour this approach, and they talk about what's happening in Portugal. They talk about what's happening in the US. I worry, though, while it may be good for people, and they are important, people who are suffering from addiction, that's really important. I worry that it mightn't be good for wider society. And by the way, before you text in, we're not naive, myself and Ciara, we know drugs are absolutely everywhere at the moment. But I think that's all the more reason to be even more careful. And I just worry that if you further normalise drug use by decriminalising it, are you going to exacerbate the problem?
Are you going to make usage more widespread? The two most commonly used drugs in this country are alcohol and cigarettes, because those are the drugs that are legal. So they've always been.
We're trying to clamp down on them.
Yeah, but putting genies back in bottles is very tricky.
Well, one last point. I just looking at the US and they went a step further. They have legalized cannabis. It has become just incredibly normal now to rock up and to roll a joint and get your drugs from the local shop or whatever. I'm not sure that's something I want from our society or in our society. What do you think?
I think we have enormous problems with our two legal drugs. I think that legalising drugs does normalise the use. I think it makes it more widespread. So I think that will happen. And if that's what we want, grand. I'm not sure it is, though. I think there is a naivety. You're saying we're not naive. I think there's a naivety to all of this. And the naivety is saying we're going to move it from the criminal justice system to a health-led sort of direction. That's what we're going to go. Health service is going to step in here. The health service that's so overstretched it can't deal with what it's dealing with now are suddenly going to take on the issue of drugs. Here's the thing. Here's the truth of it is, yes, there are lots of people out there who are addicted to drugs and who struggle with it and have issues with it, and they certainly need health intervention. They have to want it, by the way. You can't just impose that on people, so they have to engage with it actively or it's absolutely useless. But the reality is the greater majority of people who use drugs, who use weed, who use cannabis, who use coke, who use all those things, are not addicted to it. They are people who use it at the weekends recreationally, and they don't care that it comes from the Kinahans or wherever it comes from. They're using it that way. The health service has no role. So you might as well say this thing that take it out of the criminal justice system and put it into the health sort of based approach. No, take it out of the criminal justice system and you'll be putting it nowhere, because those people the health service has no role for those people. If you're someone who takes cocaine twice a month and goes to work on a Monday and gets on with your life and doesn't care about taking drugs, and it actually doesn't seem to impact on your life because you're using it recreationally occasionally, what's the health service going to do for you? Absolutely nothing.
So we're basically saying we're just the dangers of that and about the impact on society, and you're supporting criminal gangs.
The idea that the health service has the capacity to start educating people who use cocaine twice a month.
Well, maybe we need to upgrade the health system.
I'd rather we shortened our cancer waiting lists, to be honest.
There has to be some kind of health-based approach. That's not up for
health-based approach for those with addiction, but that is not everyone who uses drugs. The point is, what we're saying by decriminalising it is that probably the majority of people who use drugs now...
What's the alternative, Ciara? If somebody gets caught with a bit of coke and they're not a regular user, do we throw them in prison then?
We're already not doing that, Shane.
Yeah, so we are.
A very limited amount of people go for drug usage, maybe for criminality associated with drug usage and things like that. Look, let us know what you think. I do think usage will increase. I don't think that the health service has a role for most recreational drug users. I think that's naive to think that it has the capacity, or even that there is a role there for it. I think, and I'm afraid slightly, that we may be sleepwalking into widespread drug use here, even more so than we have already. And maybe that won't be the best thing for us and it'll be too late then. Let us know. 087 1400 106 is the WhatsApp.
Now, I spoke to the Minister of State with responsibility for public health, wellbeing, and the National Drug Strategy, Hildegard Naughton, just a few moments ago. She's going to be in attendance at today's launch. I began by asking her if she's in favour of the recommendation to decriminalise drugs.
Good morning, Shane. First of all, I want to thank the Citizens Assembly and the Chairman, Paul Reid, for the huge amount of work that they have put in over the last number of months in relation to this really important issue. I think it's the first time that we've had an open and honest conversation about drug use in this country. And I really look forward to responding to this report as a government, but I know the Oireachtas will be doing so also. So they've made 36 recommendations which need to be considered very carefully. And I will be continuing my work within the Department of Health, working with the Department of Justice in health on the health-led approach, which is part of our government commitment. That's our approach to dealing with the illicit drugs. And it has been endorsed by this report. But also I'm working on a health diversion programme where rather than people constantly going in and out of the criminal justice system, that their addiction and that their drug use, that basically they're getting a health response.
I think that is, look, I think most people would welcome that, and that seems like a common sense approach. And I think everyone agrees, the war on drugs hasn't worked. But I think people will be nervous about a decriminalised model for anyone caught in possession. Even if possession, it would seem, the recommendation is possession is still going to be illegal under the law. But there's a concern that decriminalisation, it normalises drug use.
Yeah, and I think this is a really complex issue. And that's why we set up the Citizens Assembly, so that they can consider all of these areas. And we now, as a government, and I as Minister with responsibility for drugs, have to take those recommendations and make sure that they're workable. From my perspective within the Department of Health, and from my experience in this role over the last 12 months, I've been travelling the country, meeting people in drug addiction, those with lived experience, those who work directly with people in addiction. And the real call out there is that we need to change our approach radically in relation to how we deal with drug use right across the country. But it's also important to say that where somebody commits a serious crime, that has to be dealt with through the criminal justice system. And nobody is saying otherwise. But there are people who are going in and out of our courts who have an addiction problem and who are just not
absolutely. And Minister, that needs to be taken on board, and the views of those brilliant people who work with them need to be taken on board. I suppose the worry is, though, are we bringing in a system potentially that's good for those people, but bad for wider society? Like, I don't think any of us are naive about this. Drug use is everywhere. But is there a danger if you decriminalise it, it becomes further normalised? I've heard horror stories in the US about, now I know that they have gone further in many states and legalised cannabis. By a narrow margin, it would seem the Citizens Assembly hasn't opted for that, but that it is completely normalised use there, that it is regular. Lisbon is constantly mentioned as the kind of the gold standard. Like, I've been offered cocaine while standing with my kids in Lisbon.
Yeah, there are a number of areas here around this, and I can understand people's concerns. First is education, awareness. I've committed €1.5 million funding for the first time ever for an education and awareness programme here in Ireland. But also we're going to have to tease out the whole area around drugs for personal use and this health diversion programme, and how many chances does somebody get? And we all know that, even people in addiction, people are not always ready to get the help at that time. And that's how complex this whole area is. And these are the areas that are going to have to be teased out. And this is the work that I'm doing within my department, with the Department of Justice, in relation to a health diversion programme, how that would work. But dealing with the realities of people in addiction, people who also use drugs for recreationally at the weekends, and what kind of measures we would implement there. So really this report is going to be published today. The Oireachtas will be responding to it through an Oireachtas committee. Government will also be responding to all of the recommendations, but I want to continue the momentum in relation to work on um, drug addiction,
Fair.
the funding that needs to be rolled out right
So
across the country.
nothing is going to happen imminently. A committee is going to look at this, but it does seem like changes are afoot. Um, can I ask you personally? Can I ask you just on a personal basis? And I know this isn't going to be the government policy necessarily, but do you favour the decriminalisation model proposed by the Citizens' Assembly?
I'm in favour of the health-led approach, a health diversion programme where the Gardaí working with the HSE will look at people where they have drugs for their own personal use, and this is what has to be teased out how this would work around directing people into our health services. But again, where somebody commits a serious crime or they have drugs for supply or for sale, that is completely different.
Okay. No,
And I think
absolutely.
full
It is.
rigors of the law need to apply.
Is that a cautious yes then in favour of some form of decriminalisation?
Well, I think what needs to happen now is the report will go to an Oireachtas committee. I'll be bringing a memo to Cabinet to recommend that an Oireachtas committee be established to reflect on this, to tease through all of these recommendations very carefully because they are complex. We need to continue this conversation in relation to drug use right across the country. But in the meantime, I'll be continuing my work in the Department of Health through our education awareness programs, to rolling out naloxone, which is an antidote to people who into overdose, looking at dual diagnosis, where we have people in drug addiction but also have a mental health issue that needs to be dealt with, and the many other areas around recovery and the different types of recovery for somebody who is in addiction, because it looks very different for different people.
And that was the Minister with responsibility for public health, well-being and the National Drug Strategy, Hildegard Knox.